Okay, well, welcome everyone. And you're all really welcome to this afternoon's webinar hosted by the Irish Society for Theatre Research. My name is Barry Houlihan. I'm a member of the ISTR committee. So a great pleasure to welcome everyone to this first webinar in this series hosted by the ISTR. And in particular, a very warm thank you and a very warm welcome to our two eminent guest speakers today, Dr. Siobhán O'Gorman and Professor Áine McMullen, who are going to talk to us very thematically and seasonally here on Halloween about ghosts and Irish theatre. I shall just give a quick introduction to you, Siobhán, and then I'll pass over to everyone. For anyone who isn't aware of Dr. Siobhán O'Gorman and her great work, she's head of Department of Design and Visual Arts at the Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Dún Laoghaire in Dublin. Siobhán was a core member of the International Gate Theatre Research Network, funded by the Netherlands Organisation for Scientific Research from 2017 to 21. Siobhán was also a Moore Institute visiting fellow here at University of Galway in 2018, and a Government of Ireland postdoc fellow at Trinity College Dublin from 2013 to 15. And her work has appeared in several books and journals, including Studies in Theatre and Performance, Irish Studies Review, the Journal of Adaptation in Film and Performance, and in 2021, Siobhán co-edited a themed issue of Rise on connections between Irish and European culture at the Dublin Gate Theatre, co-edited with Elaine, Sisson and Ian Walsh, as well as a special double issue of the journal Scene on Performance in Ireland with Mary Kelly and Áine Phillips. And Siobhán's books include Devised Performance in Irish Theatre, co-edited with Charlotte McIvor, and Theatre, Performance and Design, Scenography in a Modernizing Ireland, which is forthcoming, and one that will be of great interest to one and all. So Siobhán, I might pass over to you.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Can everyone hear me? Great. So I'm delighted to introduce Áine McMullen here today, who is the recipient of our Irish Society for Theatre Research Outstanding Achievement in Theatre Research Award, which we awarded her at our recent conference in Philadelphia on race and performance. So Áine is Professor Emerita of Theatre at University of Reading, and she also worked at Trinity College in Dublin from 1994 to 2005, and at Queen's in Belfast from 2006 to 2011. She's done a lot of work on Beckett. She's the author of Beckett's Intermedial Ecosystems 2021, Performing Embodiment in Samuel Beckett's Drama from 2010, Theatre on Trial, the later drama of Samuel Beckett in 1993. She's co-editor of Beckett's Afterlives, Adaptation, Remediation, Appropriation, and that's from last year, 2023, with John Bignell and Pim Verhulst, and Reflections on Beckett from 2009 with Steve Wilmer. She co-edited the very first book on Marina Carr with Kathy Leaney, and that was called The Theatre of Marina Carr Before Rules Was Made in 2003. And also a special issue, a really important special issue actually, of Australasian drama studies with Brian Singleton on Performing Ireland. So that was kind of the first, I suppose, collection of work on performance studies as it relates to Ireland that have inspired others. And with Caroline Williams, she also edited the contemporary playwright section of the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, volume number 5 in 2002. She's published essays on and lectured internationally on contemporary Irish theatre and performance, and on the theatre of Samuel Beckett. She was chairperson of the Irish National Theatre's Outreach Expert Group from 2003 to 2004, and a member of that group between 2000 and 2005. And she was a board member of Prime Cut Theatre Company in Belfast from 2006 to 2011. So I'm delighted to welcome Áine here today. And just to kick us off, really, I suppose, considering the theme of Ghosts and Machines, Irish Theatre, Past, Present and Future, and also the fact that both of us recently attended a selection of shows at the Dublin Theatre Festival, I might ask Áine to talk a little bit about that theme in relation to the Dublin Theatre Festival, both in her experience of that event historically, but also some of the shows she has seen at the 2024 festival. So I'll pass over to Áine.
Thank you, Siobhán. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction very much. Thanks to Barry for setting all this up, to ISTR for the award, for which I'm incredibly grateful, and for inviting me to take part in this webinar. and all of you here this afternoon. Thanks for your company, and of course, happy Halloween. So given the day that's in it, I thought we'd start off thinking about theatre and ghosts by turning to Marvin Carlson. So Barry, if you could just bring up that slide
Yes,
from
indeed.
the haunted stage, that'd be
Yeah.
great.
Bear with
So
me a second.
Carlson's, whoops. Ooh.
Is that on screen?
Yeah, that's great. So Carlson, oops, I have to somehow get my notes here. So Carlson's The Haunted Stage, Theatre's Memory Machine, I think really sets the stage for some of the ghosts that we will be encountering this afternoon. So just to quote from the introduction, theatre is the repository of cultural memory, but like the memory of each individual, it's also subject to continual adjustment and modification. Present experience is always ghosted by previous experiences and associations, while these ghosts are simultaneously shifted and modified by the processes of recycling and recollection. And as you get older, I can testify to the fact that that happens more and more. So Carlson also devotes chapters to various aspects of this theatrical haunting, including chapter 3, The Haunted Body. So that looks at how either a particular role in a classic play is haunted by previous actors who've played that role, but also how actors themselves are ghosted by their previous roles, and if they've reached a certain level of celebrity, by their media persona. Then the haunted production is where a new production of a play is ghosted by previous productions, for those who've seen them, of course. And finally, what Carlson calls the haunted house of the theatre. So ghosting by the architecture and the apparatus of theatre, including set, props, or aspects of scenography that may cite or be recycled from past productions. So I think we'll come across some of those ghosts and maybe some other ghosts as well. So Barry, you can take that slide down now, thanks, if you don't mind, that'd be great.
Sure.
Brilliant, thank you. So just as Siobhán was saying, to kind of take up the theme of today's webinar, which is around approaching Irish theatre, past, present and future, through the very particular prism of the Dublin Theatre Festival. And of course, we can talk about the limitations of that later. But I want to just mention this book. And I know Siobhán was holding up a copy of it later, earlier there as well. So that's Interactions, Dublin Theatre Festival, 1957 to 2007. Edited by Nikki Green and Patrick Lonergan. And that's, I think, really key in thinking about the Dublin Theatre Festival and its relation to Irish theatre more generally. And there've been a few updates on that. We'll talk about those actually later. But as today is an informal conversation and in a more personal voice, I dug out my own archive of Dublin theatre programmes going back, I'm afraid to say, to 1988. So I don't know if you can see this. It's the cover of the 1988 festival. It's quite a ghostly cover, actually, which coincided with the Dublin Millennium celebration. So that might have affected funding and so on. But of course, from its inception in 1957, the festival has always aimed to present and promote Irish theatre in an international context. In other words, presenting Irish theatre, international theatre to Irish audiences, and perhaps even theatre makers, and maybe more importantly, even showcasing Irish theatre. So in 1988, the international programme included performances from a township in South Africa. It's quite interesting, very much under apartheid still. Puppets from Japan, dance theatre from Germany, and the Royal Shakespeare Company presenting Hamlet with Mark Rylance as the Prince. But it was the showcasing of Irish theatre that really released a whole horde of ghosts for me. And one of the shows that really has stayed with me is Elizabeth Burke Kennedy's Woman in Arms. It was an absolutely brilliant production. It had premiered in 1984. And I really remember it as incredibly vibrant. It was a real ensemble performance piece that told the stories of 4 powerful women from Irish mythology. So that's Maeve, Nessa, Deirdre and Macha. But in addition to that, I saw work by CoMotion, remember them? Frank Pigg Says Hello had premiered the year before. Rough Magic, of course, staple of the Dublin Theatre Festival. Journal of Kelly, an amazing production of Dorinna McCanna's one-woman play, Dolores, performed by Sarah Jane Scaife, an incredible actor as well as director, and the premiere of Frank McGuinness's Carthaginians at the Peacock. Now, Dublin Theatre Festival is a very partial snapshot of the current state of Irish theatre in any year. But what struck me was the range of performance modes on offer back in 1988. And in addition to the above, there was dance, devised work, and loads of cabaret. Perhaps understandably, it doesn't take huge amounts of resources. And this is something Siobhán and I have often talked about. When we dig into Irish theatre history, we can often find a greater diversity of practice than we might think. Now, of course, from 1998 to 2024, so much has changed in Ireland, globally, politically, geopolitically, financially, socially, culturally, etc. And of course, the performance modes have changed, the use of technologies enormously changed. But Siobhán and I will, I think, be talking about some possible ghosts or echoes of earlier performances in some of this year's shows. And that's something we've talked about actually quite a bit. But in the next few minutes or so, I'm going to pick out 3 shows that had particular resonance, hauntings, I suppose, for me. I'm not going to talk about Safe House or Gráinne because Siobhán and I are going to talk about that. I want to stress that this is a very personal view, and thinking about it, I realized that I was in some ways very familiar with all of these shows. So I brought my own ghosts with me, if you like. And I didn't see work so much from recently established or emerging practitioners. So I'd be quite interested to hear from those of you who did, because I think that would be a very different festival. We all have our festivals. So there were several productions of single-authored plays by established playwrights of various vintages, from Brian Friel's Molly Sweeney, Tom Murphy's The House, to Marco Rowe's Reunion. And we can talk about those in the discussion if they come up. But I just want to mention Molly Sweeney by Decadent Theatre and Pavilion Theatre at Dún Laoghaire, because I really liked this production. I didn't really expect to. I saw the premiere in 1994, but I didn't have particularly intense memories of that. And Molly Sweeney's kind of reincarnation of Faith Healer from 1979, with 3 intercut monologues delivered out to the audience, but significantly in this case with a female figure. Now, what I liked about this production was that the scenography subtly, but I think really effectively, conjured Molly's world in visual and sensory terms. I mean, that's what scenography does, isn't it? As she becomes actually a kind of ghost of herself as a result of the intervention of the 2 men in her life, her husband and Dr. Rice, who for very egotistical reasons decide to cure her of her blindness. And that scenographic world, for me, really expanded the text and helped me engage with it. So the set was very minimal. It was just a bare stage with 3 chairs. Except for a raised bed of very colourful flowers at the back of the stage. And of course, Molly talks about the scent of those flowers in her speeches. And an evocative misty seascape on the cyclorama, which suggested very loosely, possibly a Donegal coast. And the lighting by Kieran Bagnall created shifts in mood and time, day, night, and also created haunting profiles, especially of Molly, even when she wasn't speaking. And the fading light at the end really mirrored Molly's retreat, closing in of her world, into a kind of ghostly limbo at the end of the play, where she's lost her tactile world, but she hasn't been able really to survive in the sighted world. And I really enjoyed the performances. So Molly Sweeney represents 3 characters through their monologues. But the next play I'm going to talk about completely deconstructs the idea of character or set, and that's Pan Pan's Exit Pursued by the Bear, by a Bear. I also saw Forced Entertainment. We can talk about that a little bit later, but I'm focusing on Irish theatre here. So Exit is a kind of reverse ghost story. in which the statue or ghost of Hermione from Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale returns to life. So the ghost kind of comes alive again. But of course, the play is transformed by Pan Pan, who had all the actors playing bears before taking on various roles. I loved the bears. So I think I've been familiar with Pan Pan's work for going right back to the 1990s. And I think they managed to deconstruct plays from Hamlet to Synge's The Playboy. And yet they also, for me, articulate something really important about those plays. And for me, all the bears came to kind of materialize the threats that Leontes' patriarchal jealousy exposes all of the other characters to, destroying also his own son, who doesn't come back to life, as the programme mentions. So we might ask, you know, who's the animal here, and looking at that interface between the human, more than human, and so on. And I thought that was another example of the scenography and the staging materializing something latent in the play, and significantly its legacies. And I think that's something that Pan Pan always does, to really investigate the ghosts and cultural baggage that collect around classic plays like Shakespeare and so on. Now, the last show that I want to mention is The Agreement, written by Belfast playwright Eoin McCafferty, which dramatised the 48 hours leading up to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. So it's a kind of documentary theatre. And I think Niall Ray spoke about this in a previous ISTR webinar, and how vibrant and funny and theatrical he found it, which I did as well. But as somebody born and raised in Northern Ireland, I vividly remember that moment 25 years ago, when the leaders of the main parties emerged kind of blinking out of Stormont. And I heard them talking kind of concessionary language that I had never heard them use before. So I find this really interesting. And for me, it was haunted not just by the ghosts of David Trimble and John Hume, who are no longer with us, but by previous plays about Northern Ireland. And I was really reminded of Stuart Parker's Northern Star, which was written in 1984, when really it was pretty dark days in Northern Ireland, and any hope of peace looked very distant. So just very briefly, the play, if you don't know it, centres on the Belfast Presbyterian, Henry John McCracken, who was executed as one of the leaders of the United Irishmen Rebellion of 1798. And the execution, or the failure of that rebellion, then ended any hope of Protestants and Catholics on the island sort of uniting against the British colonizer. And this death of hope for a shared future is embodied in one particular, for me anyway, in one particular moment in Northern Star. And I'll never forget this in performance. I've seen several performances. I can't quite remember which one this was, but just before the interval, there's a phantom bride, and she leaps onto McCracken. And for me, this was such a potent image of the past dragging not only the present, but the future back into history, back into the past, kind of suffocation, not just of the present, but also of the future. So it's really interesting and significant for me to watch the 48 hours unfold on stage that led to the emergence of a potentially livable future for Northern Ireland, however imperfect and however many remaining ghosts, unresolved ghosts, there still are. But also to realise how close it came to not happening. I mean, basically it happened because those people were enclosed in Stormont for 48 hours. And it came very close to the future once again being dragged back into the past. So it was a really nail-biting experience watching this. The kind of seemingly endless brink personship that finally delivered the agreement. So, you know, we can talk about the scenography, but I also want to mention the actors, actually, and you can kind of see Andrea Irvine here, and also in here as Mo Molam. Dan Gordon, talk about being ghosted by previous roles. Ronan Leahy as Bertie, her. And Sean Kearns is the unflappable George Mitchell. And I found this an absolute joy. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to Siobhán.
That's fantastic, Áine, and great to have those archival materials there as well to kick this off. So great to have that overview. And I think, I suppose, we didn't, between us, even manage to see everything in the Dublin Theatre Festival, but one show that we both saw and were quite struck by was Safe House. So Enda Walsh and Anna Malarkey. So, you know, and I think it kind of blew my head off in a way, but in another way, it was really ghosted by Irish theatre history. And I think maybe you feel the same. I mean, and, you know, from my perspective, you know, seeing that in the Peacock, this is exactly what the Peacock was intended for. But it also reminded me of some of the devised work, and again, of course, this is collaboratively created, but some of the devised work under the name of Tom McIntyre in the 1980s, you know, and Dermot Moore, who was one of the performers in those works, has an essay in the Carysfort, the Theatre of Tom McIntyre, edited by Bernadette Sweeney and Marie Kelly. And it's called The Lunatics in the Basement, Madness in Tom McIntyre.
Yeah.
So there was that kind of, I mean, for me, it was like the television sets, you know, the kind of grainy old footage, the debris on the set, all of that really made me, it called to mind something like Rise Up, Lovely Sweeney, you know, which you can watch in the Abbey archive. The footage is there at University of Galway. So it called that to mind, but also it's this kind of, how do we categorize this work? Because, you know, it is sung mostly throughout, you know, it's scenographically really striking as well. You know, it's post-dramatic in a way. It's not, you know, it's a fragmented kind of narrative that you're piecing together. And you know, there's elements, technology is used, there's kind of elements of the technological uncanny in there. And that actually allowed me to kind of situate it as well within operating theatre. So it's interesting that the programme you chose is from the 80s, because I think there was a lot happening in the 80s around technological change and kind of how we negotiate that and how we use that in the theatre making process. So I think with operating theatre, Roger Doyle and Alwyn Fuere, I mean, one work in particular from them was Switch, about a switchboard operator that Alwyn plays. But that was, I think, the first time in Ireland, or the first time that I can find. I need to clarify. I need to, you know, further evidence this, but that the Fairlight, the Fairlight was used. That, you know, Kate Bush used it in her performances, but that it was used in a theatrical devising process as well. So there's that kind of, you know, how sound and technology work together to play into a technological uncanny, the kind of avatar figures. Yeah, I mean, I haven't given a synopsis of the work because it's quite difficult, but I don't know. I know we had some shared thoughts on that, Anna.
Absolutely. And I was fascinated by the fact that I find it very difficult to define as well. You know, it's a one-woman performance. It has sets. It's multimedia, but it's sung. And I find that really interesting. And it brought to mind for me also shows like the Wooster Group and the way that they use screens and fragmented both screen images and between the screen and the live performance to really fragment senses of identity. And that obviously was really important in terms of telling Grace's story in Safe House, that you really got that sense of somebody's fragmented psyche that again is actually played out by all of the different languages of the stage, oral, visual, and so on. Can I ask you actually what you made of the coming in front of the stage? At the beginning, the performer, see, I'm sure I have a note of her somewhere, the singer,
she was fantastic. I do have
Kate Gilmore.
Yeah, Kate Gilmore
actually came in front of the stage. So you had the curtains, and there was quite a lot of play with curtains all the way along. I don't know if that had any particular resonance for you.
That didn't strike me. I mean,
I mean,
mean,
playing with theatre, with you know, self-consciously theatre, and
yes, there's a kind of meta theatrical element
yeah,
there, kind of
exactly, yeah,
screens within screens, and I suppose the use of kind of newer technologies as well,
yeah,
with the very practical kind of, but also ghostly use of like playing the Eurovision, you know,
yeah,
Celine
yeah,
Dion.
yeah,
I mean, that was really interesting. I mean, so that's a really good way to kind of use scenography, both to evoke period, but also to it kind of added to that kind of ghostly element. And I think
yeah,
that, you know, I think it's like, and how do we define it? Again,
yeah,
like you said, it kind of redefines solo performance,
yeah,
but it's not without history in an Irish theatre
yeah,
context, you
yeah,
know, like operating theatre describe themselves as music theatre.
yeah, yeah.
There's that book by, it could be post-dramatic theatre. There's that book by Matthew Rebstock and Nicholas Till, which is composed theatre. Is it
Mm-hmm.
composed theatre? Is that how we
Yeah,
would define it? And I mean, they do talk in there a bit about the technological uncanny as something that kind of manifests in performance forms at a time of technological change, which of course,
yes,
you know,
absolutely.
kind of been through a digital revolution during
Yeah,
COVID, and you know, now we're kind of negotiating AI and
yeah,
all of that. I guess, you know, I mean, I saw Grania as well. Um, but you know, another show that I saw was Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, which was Javad Alipour. Um,
yeah. Tell us a little bit about that. I didn't see that.
yeah, yeah. So that was with Chris Thorpe as the dramaturg there, and it was all about a well, it was all about what was framed as the Iranian answer to Tom Jones. So it's a singer called Faroudun Farrokhzad, who, so that was one of our obviously international shows, and it was like English and Australian, but it was, you know, negotiating, I suppose, um, yeah, Iranian identity, you know, and in a kind of English context and more broader internationally. But that whole idea of, you know, Farrokhzad being the Iranian answer to Tom Jones is kind of problematized from the perspective of Spivak, you know, and this idea of the subaltern, and everything is in relation to a Western version of that
Mm,
thing. Um, but there, I mean, it was this combination again of more recent technologies, I guess, as part of the aesthetic, but and live music throughout, which was beautiful. Um, but also using kind of grainy old footage of
yeah,
Bergsad in, you know, on television. He had his own television show. He was mysteriously murdered. So it's kind of, again, it kind of reminded me a little bit of operating theatre and some of their early work, you know. But it's part lecture, part podcast, a part murder mystery podcast, and you know, part theatre and live music performance. Um, so I mean, that was a really interesting one as well, in terms of kind of referencing kind of popular forms of today as well with the
yeah.
podcast, you know, and some of the research that was being done from the podcast being projected and kind of
Mm,
performed live alongside the grainy old footage, and you know how research, the process of research is being used as part of the aesthetic
mm.
as well. And, you know, they had someone who actually has a podcast called Rama Mami, whose father was killed in Iran and moved to Canada and does a podcast in his mother's basement. So he was one of the
Wow.
performers in it. So,
Yeah,
and I mean, again, like I think the idea for Ghosts and Machines came from Safe House, but it was interesting to see that again and kind of like the use of technology and, you know, how all that's being negotiated, I guess.
yeah. It was fascinating, all those different generations of technology. And I was
Yeah.
just fascinated by the way they kept your sense of the space and time of the stage just kept shifting. So you had
Yes.
those images of the past, very grainy, projected, and of course that image of the airing cupboard, which is so powerful, where she hides as a
Yes.
child, and then that's recreated on stage. I just want to come back to those curtains, actually,
Okay.
just to kind of maybe introduce another element. Um,
Are we ghosting Beckett and
because
Marina
I was
Carr
also,
as well?
yeah, um, but I was also interested when she breaks, you know, the frame and actually comes into the stage
Mm.
and looks at the audience. And for me, the Safe House was also ghosted by all of those stories of marginalized women by poverty, by abuse. I didn't see Starjazzer, but I had a ticket actually, and for various reasons I wasn't able to get there, which was bringing together kind of a Shauna Casey era woman with a contemporary woman. And of course, you know, just thinking of a lot of those plays from Marina Carr, Boileau Gongora, etc.
I mean, we did have a character called Curtains in one of those plays.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. But I was also thinking of Emily Pine's work, actually, where she's asking questions about how do we as an audience consume these stories of marginalized people or people living on the streets and so on. And I actually thought that the performance raised some of those questions when she actually, you know, stares at the audience. And at one moment, she really does look at the audience as if, you know, why are you looking at me? And I think she throws her teddy bear into one of the audience members. But it just raised for me those questions. And I think quite self-consciously, I don't know if other people got that sense of how do we consume these images? You know, what kind of witness are we? Some of those questions that Emily Pine asks, I think, in The Memory Marketplace and some of her other work.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite intimate at times as well.
Absolutely.
So, you know, when she kind of came down into the audience as well and sung to us. And I mean, some people have said it would, and I mean the use of the Irish language. So we have that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Well,
absolutely. Yeah.
You know, because the character is from Berna, and there's kind of ghosts of her past calling to her, you know, and asking her where she is and is she okay, and all of that, and the use of translation on the screen, and then the very beautiful video work as well, that, you know, you get the fragments of her childhood trauma, I guess, as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's being beaten by her mother, so that's a kind of an angle on that whole sort of question of the abuse of children.
It was a very feminine piece of work as well. I mean, it kind of, you know, like you're saying, the early Marina Carr, this kind of idea of the, you know, these ideas of the French feminists working back in the 1980s, you know, Raguet and Cizou and Kristeva, who were known as the French feminists, even though Kristeva is Bulgarian, I think. But, you know, so it's that kind of like, that psyche, that is something that's kind of Lacanian kind of idea, you know, that it's not.
But I love the different shifts in her performance, actually, that sometimes she was very childish, sometimes she was very angry.
Yeah.
You know, and so actually there were different modes of performance, I think. You know, throughout the performance. But other people may have very different perspectives on Safe House. It's interesting also in terms of Enda Walsh's collaborations. I think I saw one of his pieces in London, which was an opera, Doncha maybe. So obviously it's interesting, you know, that he's really moving away from that model of the single authored play into a much more collaborative, he's using much more kind of multimedia, music, text, images, and
David Bowie.
David Bowie, exactly. Well, sadly, I didn't see that, but absolutely. And moving also into sort of blurring those lines, you know, sort of contemporary music, ballad, and, you know, coming back to that whole idea of how do we define this? And I love the fact that I was puzzling over that.
Yes, absolutely. And there was that kind of, it was, and even the singing and the, you know, where you would situate that, it reminded me of The Last Dinner Party and Florence Welch, Florence and the Machine, but then kind of going back to Kate Bush and Stevie Nicks. So there was
really interesting
in terms of echoes of the past, but then using quite current technologies and quite old technologies as well.
Can we
Um,
move on to Gráinne?
Let's get on to Gráinne, and especially because you've picked up on women at the margins there and marginalized women, so I think that's a good way to maybe segue in to Gráinne.
Well, it was just wonderful to see Gráinne on the stage, on the Abbey stage. I mean, it was first premiered in 1912. And I'm not sure that it's had any performance since then. It certainly has been off the stages for quite a long time. So it was just fascinating to see that.
It had 2 in the US, I think, in
Right,
Lady Gregory's lifetime.
right.
And then, but as far as I know, it's never been performed on the Abbey stage. So that was
Yeah.
quite momentous, like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was an important moment.
Yeah, it felt really important moment, directed by Katrina McLaughlin. Gosh, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I've taught Grania, and I always love teaching the play. I think it's a really important play, actually. You know, about the kind of well, first of all, just generally the manipulation of women as possessions amongst men. I mean, that comes across really, really clearly. And maybe more specifically within an Irish context, about women's idealization as sort of icons of the nation, Mother Ireland, you know, the lady with the harp, whatever, while actually ignoring or erasing their actual agency. And I think that for me is really interesting. And with students, I've always enjoyed discussing that, the end of the play, where Grania actually reclaims agency in a very limited way, of course, by sort of embracing going back with Finn as the only way she can take up a position within the social and cultural life of her time. And I think it's quite interesting to think about Lady Gregory in that way as well. Somebody we now know, you know, had quite a complicated personal life, was sidelined by Yeats, of course, in relation to Kathleen Houlihan, but actually then became, you know, an important figure in the cultural life. But, you know, just look at her plays and how seldom until recently they've been performed. And actually there is a fantastic essay by Cathy Leaney in the Irish University Review devoted to Lady Gregory. That's 2004, which really explores Grania in a lot of detail.
And they used that, they referenced that in the program.
In the program, yeah, exactly, which is really interesting. But it's really, I remember, Siobhán, when we talked about this, the first thing we said was, didn't it remind you of Joe Vanek's design for Dancing at Lunasa?
Yes. Yeah.
And I wondered whether they'd gone into the basement and kind of recycled some of that.
I mean, it would be good to know. Maybe there's someone here into that. But immediately that struck me. Yeah, absolutely.
Me too.
And you know, when you're talking about these figures on the margins as well, you know, the 2 singers are kind of like contemporary vagabonds, you know, on stage.
Displaced people, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because somebody said to me, Elaine from Trinity, just as soon as you go in, just watch what's happening on stage before the curtain rises. And of course, that's the girl in the tent, the contemporary person getting a cup of coffee. And so it's kind of creating that sort of segue between Lady Gregory's time and the contemporary time. Although I have to say there are limits to that, given that they were royal displaced people, but still living outside of the structures of society for a certain amount of time.
And kind of time as well, the kind of overlaying of the past, the present there as well. I went to the Post show and we didn't actually talk since I went to the Post.
Oh no, tell us about that then.
Because I'd already seen it with Charlotte, who's here. And then there was a Post show a couple of days later on a Tuesday night. So I went in just for the Post show then, and that was Cathy Leaney and Melissa Sierra, and there were just some interesting things I noted there. I mean, it was fantastic, and I mean, they could have talked about it forever, but
absolutely,
one of the things that Melissa raised was that you know, the ghosts, what we have here is we have the ghosts, the ghost of Lady Gregory's biography haunting the play, of course, but we can't over determine that because it is its own, but also the ghosts of women in theatre whose work has been historically attributed to men. And I mean, of course,
that's really interesting.
Lady
Kathleen
Gregory is one
Houlihan,
of them. And I mean, but there have been others. I mean, there are ghostly women working behind the scenes in other aspects beyond writing as well. Like if we think about Carolyn Swift, you know, she was really keeping the show on the road at the Pike
Theatre, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
but she was the assistant director to her husband, Alan Simpson. It happens a lot with married collaborators, actually. You know, so we've that ghostly work. And then Molly McEwen, who I write about, you know, and not so much with her work at the Gate, with Edwards and MacLeamore, but certainly with her work with Tyrone Guthrie. If you look around in the archive, you can see how, you know, some of her ideas scenographically, she was a designer who she worked in, people probably aren't familiar, but got her start at the Gate in the 1930s and then went on to have a very long career where she worked for the Edinburgh Festival, and then she worked at the Citizens Theatre up to the 1980s. But you know, her work was, some of her ideas, I think, got subsumed under the work of Tyrone Guthrie as well. So I think that it's interesting to think about Grania, actually, and, you know, its monumental kind of significance on the Abbey stage, but also what that brings up in
terms of other histories. Absolutely. And just while we're on that, actually, with immaculate timing, some of you might have received the email this morning from the Abbey Theatre, but just a huge shout out to another Gate woman whose play is going to be presented as part of the Abbey Spring Season 2025, and that is Mary Manning. Youth Season is coming up in April 25, directed by Sarah Jane Scaife. So that's really exciting. And Youth Season is I don't know if anybody knows, I love that play. It has a central gay character. It is done in a kind of expressionist mode. Mary Manning, central figure at the Gate with Edwards and MacLeamore, was also Samuel Beckett's cousin.
Oh, wow.
And there is a tortured soul in that play called Terence, who is, again, you know, anecdotally modelled on Samuel Beckett, and who has an entirely silent alter ego called Ego Smith. And we know that Beckett did actually consult with Mary Manning on it, but it's very much, you know, Mary Manning's play. And she also wrote a lot about theatre in the Gates
Journal.
Motley, wasn't it called?
I think it was Motley, yeah.
Motley. So actually, I mean, again, I've taught this play, and I have been waiting, as with Grania, you know, for decades to see a production. So I'm more than excited about that, and that's coming up in April next year.
That's fantastic.
I mean,
Beckett had to find his way in.
I had to find a way of mentioning Beckett. Absolutely. So I'm not sure what to say about the actual performance of Grania. In some ways, I kind of felt the set sort of, I mean, I wondered how that might have worked if we'd almost brought the three characters out a little bit more.
Maybe swallowed them a little bit.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
Good to see those ghosts of dancing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the gold dress. I love that bit at the end where she says, "Oh, just as well I brought my gold dress." So maybe this is a moment, I see it's 2:45, where we might open it up. Barry, do you think that would work? Or is there anything else you want to say on that?
Did you want to talk a little bit maybe about not Beckett? I mean, we touched when we talked about this, about, you know,
just before
diversity.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting, because we were talking a little bit about futures. And there were, I mean, a lot of work that I didn't see at the festival, and I was particularly interested in some of the more diverse plays, you know, the Rachel Baptiste program, Shola Anolu, because I think I kind of missed that in some of the main stage performances. Something like Reunion, you know, had, you know, an entirely white cast, and I wondered, you know, whether that could have been an opportunity to look at a more kind of diverse casting, really. And
I agree.
the reason perhaps that's unfair, but the reason I was thinking about Not Beckett, that is a program, it's very much work in progress. 5 short pieces inspired by Beckett, not at all Beckett, but inspired by Beckett, put together by Hannah Khalil. He's an Irish-Palestinian playwright. And they're really about 15, 20 minutes long. And they're by women of an Irish heritage. And they describe themselves as femme identifying and non-binary. So there was a really wonderful piece by Femi Speaks, telling the story of a Nigerian woman whose husband flies off to seek citizenship in the UK and then moves to Dublin. So she waits for him to contact her, which she doesn't, and then finally she says, okay, myself and the child that she has of his, before he leaves, they decide to go to the UK, and then the husband says, no, go to Dublin. So she's actually in a Dublin, one of these holding centres. And then finally at the end, she does manage to get a passport, and she says, yes, I am learning to dream without you, without the husband, on behalf of her child. But altogether, it felt like a very, very contemporary set of voices. There was also Nicola McCartney, Olwen Fwery wrote a really beautiful piece for that. And I just thought altogether, it represented something that felt very contemporary. There were references to asylum seekers, to displaced people. They had a women's basketball team at one point, which is great. But, a rising star, somebody who was on crutches, and somebody in a wheelchair who quoted from Endgame. So that just felt very contemporary. Now, I think had I taken a different trajectory at the Dublin Theatre Festival, I think that would have had some of those voices in it, really. But it was just something I wanted really to mention, perhaps.
And just something to flag as well, and something else that Olwen was involved in that I thought was absolutely fantastic. And I know that Charlotte, who's here, did the post show for this at the Galway Arts Festival over the summer. That was Christian O'Reilly in collaboration with Liz Kerr, Matt Fraser and Olwen Fwery, and directed by Fwery and Kelly Hughes. Unspeakable Conversations. Did you see that one?
No, I saw the
program.
I saw the program for that. I mean, again, really looking at those questions of disability and so on.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So again, just thinking a little bit about diverse voices.
Inclusivity.
And inclusivity,
exactly. So it'll be interesting. And also, I think we were just talking earlier about Roisha Gowan as the incoming director of the Dublin Theatre Festival. So also, really important moment, as Willie White, after 11 years, was it, handing over the baton. So I think that's really, really interesting.
So thank you, Anna. So I think
thank you, Siobhán.
Thank you. And we might open it up now, because as you said yourself, people will have had very different journeys through Dublin Theatre Festival, whether it's the recent one or historical ones, or other kinds of ideas around ghosts and machines. I mean, whether it's the machine of the patriarchy or the, or the, the technology, or, so does anyone have any questions or any comments that you'd like to make, perhaps? And I don't know if Barry wants to take over from me and chair this, or am I?
I'll just maybe assist you in that, Siobhán.
Thank you.
Questions, and I see one already. Luke Lamont is there. If Luke, I think you might be first in line. If you want to go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. I feel like this should be an annual event. Just after the Theatre Festival. Just recapping. I wanted to note that I based on your discussion of Safe House, that the actor Kate Gilmore was actually in a show about 10 years ago, maybe, called Town is Dead by Philly McMahon and lost the name. Grace Donnell, which was it was like a playthrough music, but it also featured like this kind of revenant figure, Barbara Brennan's son from the 1980s, and it was the last thing that I could think that Kate was in the Peacock as well. So I just noted the kind of the haunting of that, so that might work if you're continuing discussions.
Yeah. What was that called again, Luke?
It was called Town is Dead.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think I have a badge. I think they were giving out free badges with Town is Dead on them for a while. Great. But obviously, yeah, it kind of was like talking about the kind of the echoes of the past. So not quite as post-dramatic as I'm imagining. I haven't got to see Safe House yet, but I know that it's still on until the 16th of next month. But there sounds like there's certain kind of artistic resonances between that and the kind of a certain haunting of the space between that. So that just perked my interest. You mentioned Áine, you mentioned the forced entertainment production, and I was thinking about disembodied voices, and then I went to see and you're the person to talk about in terms of Beckett and embodiment. And I was thinking about the kind of disembodied voice in Craft's Last Tape, which is the last two productions I've seen in Dublin were Craft's Last Tape and Forced Entertainment. So if you had any time to kind of go over Forced Entertainment's piece, Signal to Noise, I'd love to hear you speak about it. But I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So it's really interesting. I've forgotten the name of it now, but I don't know if anybody's come across a software. I think it's by Google, and you can feed in a lecture note, you can feed in meeting notes, and what it gives you back is a conversation with these kind of really sort of generic American voices, male, female, saying, "Oh wow, and what do you think about this?" Yeah, that's exactly what this sort of really false animated, artificially generated voices, and that's really what Signal to Noise was all about. And I love the fact that I mean, it's typical forced entertainment. You go in and there's no set, there's just rows of costumes and wigs, and so the actors use microphones, but actually you realize that the voices are voiceovers, and they're all of these sort of generic American voices. And increasingly it all goes haywire, like a kind of computer with a virus. And the voices, it's almost like talking about haunting, that the voices are possessing the bodies. So I think it's a later stage almost from Craft's Last Tape, where actually it's the voice that is possessing the bodies. I mean, like turning us all into machines. I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? That, you know, even your machine tells you how it wants you to interact with it. And there was really that sense that it was all about the actors being possessed by these voices. And also then when the voice traverse different bodies, because sometimes somebody would take up the microphone and actually somebody else would be speaking, and the energy was manic, wasn't it? I mean, completely manic. They were running across the stage, and so nothing was stable. Everything was constantly changing. I mean, I loved it actually.
So did I. You put it so well, because the idea of like Craft's Last Tape is that he can kind of edit what he's hearing.
Yeah.
He's controlling the machine, but as you said, the machine voices were really controlling the actors.
Exactly, and that was very much what it was about. Yeah,
and I loved it.
Yeah, it's one of the things about forced entertainment. At the time, you think, "Whoa, what's happening?" But actually, afterwards, when you think about it, you think, "Oh, yeah." Thank you. That's really interesting.
Oh, thank you for elaborating on it. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
People are having to go to meetings at 3.
Yeah, maybe while anyone else is formulating their thoughts, just if I might just add a quick comment or a bit more from you, Áine, on the Craft's Last Tape that you mentioned there, Luke, in the Stephen Ray production I saw recently, with
I love to see
Landmark.
that.
So I was at the post show, and Stephen Ray said he recorded his voice for that play 20 years ago, in the hope that he might someday play the play and play in Crap. So the voice we were hearing was actually his own voice from.
And it was his, because I've heard another actor, I can't remember who it was, saying that they recorded it, but they couldn't use it in the end. It didn't work.
Oh, really?
So for Stephen Ray, it actually worked. That's interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
I'd love to have seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great.
It's coming back, actually. It's going to be on
It's
later
on now.
this
It's on
month.
again.
It's on now, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. I think there's anything in the chat if anyone wants to raise their hand. Lots of people saying thank you in the comments.
Oh, bless you. Yeah, I think people maybe have to run at 3.
Yeah.
Any final burning questions? Feel free to break in. Or comments.
Probably teaching with Andy Keogh in a few weeks. I can ask him if they reused the set for from Dancing at Lunasa for Grania.
Oh, please do.
I'm sure
yeah.
they did. They're mad for that.
It's very much a thing in contemporary sustainable scenography, isn't it? About recycling
Absolutely, yeah.
elements of set and so on.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they did.
It's going to be really, I mean, it's going to be really interesting, I think, to see next year's program, some of which I'm sure will have been set up actually, but also, and Barry, you know this, going back to my programs, gosh, it was really intense experience. It really did release some of those memories in a really strong way.
Yeah.
Interesting in terms of Barry's project, the oral histories. You often use archival materials to trigger a discussion in some way, you know, and to
absolutely.
Yeah.
It looks as if folks are heading off. It's 3 minutes to 3.
Yeah, we might wrap things up there because people are filtering off. Only to add my thanks again to Áine and Siobhán. It's been fabulous and brilliant to hear from you both. And the ghosts of your archive, Áine, have been great to hear about as well. And we might hear more of them again. We'll unearth more of those treasures that you have and hear more of those theatre memories from you both. So thanks so much for being part of this. So this is the first webinar for ISTR's forthcoming festival season. We have another one coming up. We're at the end of October now. There'll be another one announced for November shortly. So do keep an eye out for that. And we'll circulate the details online. And we look forward to another webinar by the end of next month. So yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks to Siobhán and thanks to Áine and for everyone for joining us. And we'll put the recording of this up shortly.
That the conference will be announced imminently as well. The 2024 conference, which will be hosted at IADT from the 6th to the 7th of June 25.
And yes, thank you, Barry, for setting all of this up.
Thanks so much.
And Siobhán, always brilliant to talk to you, Siobhán.
You too.